we're looking into refurbishing the holiday stars and trees that we have up around town. When they come down at the end of the month, the start of the new year, we'll also be looking at the potential purchase of holiday decorations at the sale prices, I guess you could say, after the holiday season. This is something that we discussed during the City Council budget process that we went through earlier this year. And so just wanted to provide that update. We've had a couple different questions from the community on that front.
Second, I live on West 10th Street. Deer come down from the mountain day and night and cross the street. Occasionally they are hit. Can you please put deer crossing signs 3 places along 10th Street? There's numerous deer the police are cleaning up. That's what I have to say.
Over the last 13 years, you've grown by about 11%. Over the next 20 years, Portland State University is projecting a lower growth rate on average. It's projecting a growth rate of about 0.3% per year. I will say that in most communities across the state where we're doing these analyses, they are showing pretty similar trends. There's just a few communities where I'm seeing their projections showing higher rates of growth, but in most communities that we've been working in, they're showing lower rates of growth than what we've seen in the last 20 years, or the last, in the last 10 to 20 years.
Now is the time for a public hearing to receive testimony regarding General Ordinance 23-1404, an ordinance amending the city comprehensive plan. Goal 10, housing, and adopting the housing and residential lands needs assessment, and the buildable lands inventory update. I will open the public hearing and ask for a staff report. Following the staff report, I will call for testimony for support of the issue, followed by testimony in opposition of the issue. At the conclusion of the testimony, the public hearing will be closed and the matter turned over to the City Council for deliberation and a decision. I'm now opening the public hearing and I'm asking for a staff report. Will staff please give your report?
Oh, just a moment. I'm going to share my screen here.
Okay. I believe we're hearing from Caitlin Cook, who is our senior planner with the city.
Hello, Mayor Mays, city councilors, and staff. My name is Caitlin Cook. I'm a planner with the City of the Dalles Community Development Department. I'm here this evening to present a staff report for the Comprehensive Plan Amendment 55-23 and to present the housing needs analysis as well as the buildable lands inventory. So starting in the spring of 2023, the City of the Dalles has been working with Johnson Economics and MIG on the housing needs analysis update and the buildable lands inventory to update the previously adopted housing needs analysis from 2016. This evening, I'm joined by Matt Hasty from MIG Consulting to present on the housing needs analysis and the buildable lands inventory. Mr. Hasty, would you care to share your screen?
Yes, just give me one sec. All right, can everybody see that okay? Yeah, okay.
Yep.
Yes.
So I'll give a fairly brief presentation. It'll be pretty similar to what you saw at the work session where we presented to y'all on the same topic a few weeks ago. So it's fairly brief. I'll be happy to answer questions during or after the presentation as well. And I'll just kind of go through an overview of the process, the findings, and what's being recommended. So just kind of an overview of the process. There's sort of 2 primary parts to a housing needs analysis. One is assessing the need for future housing, kind of the demand side of things. And the second is inventorying the supply of land that's zoned for residential use that can potentially accommodate the future need. So they're kind of the 2 main pieces. Then we go through a process of comparing the need and the demand, and then identifying a set of updates to the comprehensive plan, both in terms of the narrative in the plan that summarizes the findings from the reports and analyses, and updates to goals, policies, and implementation strategies in the plan. And so we've gone through that process, and we worked with the Planning Commission and a number of other community members to advise us on this process. And now we're here in the adoption process after work sessions with you all and the Planning Commission, and an adoption hearing with the Planning Commission as well. This is just sort of another look at the process in terms of the schedule. We got started back in April. We did a lot of the technical work kind of in the spring, met with the Planning Commission a couple of times in August to review the results of the analysis, review the recommendations related to goals and policies, then conducted a work session with y'all back in September, and then had again an adoption hearing with the Planning Commission in November, and now in front of y'all. So that's the process. And as Caitlin said, this is an update to work that was done back in 2016. So we updated that analysis, and then updated the work we'd done previously around recommended changes to goals and policies and strategies in the comprehensive plan. So just kind of an overview of what's in these reports and what's kind of underpinning the analysis. Excuse me for a second. I'd taken a bite of food before I got started. I'm going to just like finish with that so I don't distract you. All right, apologies for that. So kind of components of that demand side of the equation, the future housing need. We're looking at demographic trends. We're looking at current housing conditions and current housing needs, and coming up with an estimate of current needs. So kind of how well is the existing supply meeting the current need, and then projecting needs out over the next 20 years to 2043, and assessing the need for specific types of housing that would need to be built to meet those needs over that 20-year period. And as Caitlin mentioned, Johnson Economics is a member of our team. They're a market analysis and economist firm. And so they did really the work on the demand side of the equation. Unfortunately, Brendan Buckley from there was not available tonight. So I'm doing my best to channel the economists and present that piece of the work. So they use a pretty wide variety of data sources in this process. Population data from both the 2020 census and the American Community Survey, which is also essentially census data that's updated a little more regularly than the decennial census. Projections of population come from the Portland State University Population Center. Cities across the state outside of the Portland metro region are bound to use those forecasted growth rates. And when PSU puts together those projections, they update them every 4 years. They do them at a county level, and then they break them down to the cities and the unincorporated communities within the county. And they have some fairly detailed reports about the assumptions that go into those projections. But those are used kind of throughout the state. Within the metro area, the Portland metro area, Metro is responsible for the population projections, but outside of that area, it's PSU that's doing those projections. And then we're also looking at a variety of different types of market data. So regional multiple listing service, RMLS data, information that comes from both sales providers, but also some databases. CoStar is one that has a lot of information kind of nationwide and statewide related to rental properties, as well as data from the city, the county, the state, and the school district, including information related to the homeless population and kind of incidents of homelessness in the Dalles and in Wasco County. So just a little bit of a snapshot of some of the data that we gathered and summarized in the housing needs analysis report, and also in the proposed updates to the comprehensive plan. In terms of your existing housing, households are split between about 62% being owners of the housing they're in and 38% renting their housing. As you might guess, the owner-occupied housing is on average larger than the rental housing. So 78% of those units are 3 or more bedrooms, whereas rental units, 64% or about 2/3 are 2 bedrooms or fewer. And the chart on kind of the bottom left gives you a breakdown of housing by number of bedrooms. And in terms of tenure, whether somebody owns or rents their home, that's sort of what the chart on the right is showing you. And it's showing that for owner-occupied housing, the bulk of that housing is in single-family detached homes, kind of traditional home on an individual lot, whereas the rental housing is kind of spread across a wider array of housing types or housing structure types, I guess. So it also includes apartments. That's kind of the multifamily, 5 units or more, row houses or townhouses, duplexes, other plexes. Manufactured homes show up both as rental and owner-occupied housing. In terms of kind of looking ahead, well, looking backwards and looking forwards towards how much growth you've seen and how much is projected by Portland State University in the future. Over the last 13 years, you've grown by about 11%. Over the next 20 years, Portland State University is projecting a lower growth rate on average. It's projecting a growth rate of about 0.3% per year. I will say that in most communities across the state where we're doing these analyses, they are showing pretty similar trends. There's just a few communities where I'm seeing their projections showing higher rates of growth, but in most communities that we've been working in, they're showing lower rates of growth than what we've seen in the last 20 years or the last, in the last 10 to 20 years. But that's what's being projected for the Dalles over the next 20 years. So that equates to an increase in population of about 1,000 people. That would be equate or kind of end up being about 400 households when you think about the number of people in each household, but a larger number of housing units. There's a couple of reasons there. One, to make up, to ensure that there's a healthy vacancy rate among housing units. And two, because there's a little bit of a deficit of housing now in terms of the fairly low vacancy rate. So it equates to about 500 new housing units or a 7% increase in the number of housing units in the Dalles over the next 20 years. Average household size is expected to stay pretty similar at about 2.5 people per household on average. And the percentage of family households of total households is projected to be 61%. In terms of the mix of housing that's projected to be needed over that time period, we're projecting kind of, a pretty wide mix of units, about 61% of those being, again, detached units or sort of typical one house on its own individual lot, not connected to or attached to another house. And then the rest of the units kind of spread across some of those other housing types I talked about earlier. So townhomes, flexes, duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, apartments, about 107 units. And for these analyses, we tend to assume that the percentage of manufactured homes and parks stays about the same. So we are projecting a potential need for additional units of those types as well. So that gives you a sense of the mix. And there's a variety of kind of demographic factors and income and housing market factors that go into that projected mix of housing units. Just kind of some notes, and this is more thinking ahead, I think, to one of the follow-up things that cities are required to do now after adopting a housing needs analysis is to prepare what's called a housing production strategy. And that's really aimed at the city identifying strategies it can undertake to essentially encourage production of future housing units of the types that are identified as needed in the housing needs analysis. So this slide just sort of talks about the fact that the private market is going to meet some of the needs in the housing market. And then there's other needs that are more often going to be met by nonprofit housing developers or through housing that's subsidized by government agencies or nonprofit groups. So, and those are really aimed typically more at housing for households with lower incomes, because of the cost of developing housing units can't typically, you can't meet that all through the market. So this is just kind of a recognition of that fact. And when you get into that housing production strategy process, those are the kinds of strategies you tend to focus on, or not just you, but cities in general. So that's kind of the demand side of the equation. On the supply side, we went through a process of looking at land in the urban growth boundary that's essentially zoned for housing. So we started out with kind of everything in the urban growth boundary. Then we narrowed that down to land that's zoned to accommodate housing. Then we take that land and we separate, we kind of deduct, this is kind of a narrowing or a winnowing process. So we deduct properties that they may be zoned for residential use, but they're committed or planned for some kind of public or institutional use. So a school property, a city-owned property that's programmed for some kind of public or institutional use, those types of things. We also deduct out land that's constrained by natural features or natural hazards. And I'll show you just kind of a quick illustration of that on a subsequent slide. But anything that's got wetlands, floodplains, steep slopes over a certain percentage, those properties or portions of properties that are constrained by those types of features get extracted out of the inventory, so they don't make up part of the estimated buildable land that's in the inventory. And we also deduct out land that's needed for streets or infrastructure. So that's kind of a percentage that comes off the top. We end up with then land that we call net buildable acres that could accommodate future housing needs. And then we apply an average density of development to those lands to come up with a capacity in terms of housing units on the land. There's some things we don't sort of factor out or use to deduct things from the inventory. So, and this is really prescribed by kind of state administrative rules and statutes to a very large degree. We don't deduct out land that doesn't have currently sewer and water facilities. If it's in the urban growth boundary, it's expected to be served over time. Although there are cases where we can do that if there's just no way to serve those properties. Property owner willingness, we understand that there's a number of properties where the property owner isn't interested or willing to develop that property now. But over the long term, if it's in the urban growth boundary, that's not sort of a criterion for us to be able to just take it out of the inventory. And there are market factors that make it more expensive or more difficult to develop land. And those are the types of things, all of these are types of things that are kind of the subject of that housing production strategy, but not things that we use to kind of pull land out of the inventory as part of this process. This is just a slide that shows you the areas that were identified as constrained. So floodways and water bodies, the flood hazard area, and anything that's got a slope of 25% or more. We don't, and so what we do with that constrained area information is we deduct out not necessarily the whole parcel, unless the whole parcel is covered by one of those constraints, then we would deduct it from the inventory. That doesn't mean somebody couldn't develop a portion of that property or develop a house on that property, but for inventory purposes, we assume it's constrained. For properties where a portion of the property is constrained by slopes, in this case, that's what this hatched area is showing. That area gets deducted from that property. We also, if there's a house on the property, we deduct the area associated with the existing house. And then we assume the remainder of the property could accommodate additional housing units. So that's kind of how that process works. So then ultimately we identify again the net buildable acres, gross and net buildable acres. This table summarizes that. I think the kind of the key columns, and it summarizes it by zoning designation and whether the properties are vacant, they're completely vacant, there's not, or at least they don't have a home on them, or whether they're partially vacant, they have a home or houses, but they have the space to accommodate additional development based on the zoning and the size of the property. So that's what partially vacant means here. So this shows the supply of land as if you add up the bottom two numbers on the right bottom of the table, that's about 330 acres of net buildable land, or actually I think it's gross buildable land within the city that could accommodate future housing. And then actually, let me go back up real quick. The colors on this map are just indicating whether land's vacant, green, partially vacant, or developed. So a lot of the land in the city in your residential areas is developed, and that's what the red is showing. Green's vacant and yellow's partially vacant. And then this is the comparison of those two sides of the equation. I've been talking about the supply side, or the buildable lands inventory, and then the demand side, the projected number of people and ultimately new housing units, which are then equated into acres based on the average lot size or density of development in different zones. And or I guess better or worse, what this is showing is it is showing, based on all the assumptions and the analysis, that you have an adequate supply of land to meet those future housing needs over the next 20 years. Again, assuming the projection rates I mentioned, assuming all the things we have to assume related to land supply, et cetera. So that's ultimately what this is showing. So that's kind of the technical analysis that's being presented here. I'll also just note, when we're thinking about kind of the capacity of a given property to accommodate a certain number of units, we're primarily looking at the lot sizes and densities that are allowed in your code and your development code, as well as the mix of housing types that we assume will occur in a given type of zone. Typical development practices in terms of, do developers tend to maximize the number of units they can get on a property, but also what's the pattern of existing residential lots in an area. So we don't just kind of max it out. We kind of also look at what's typically happened in the Dalles and what is happening, particularly in recent developments. So that's, again, kind of the technical analysis. All of that kind of underpins then the updates to the comprehensive plan. So the proposal is to adopt both the housing needs analysis, but also these amendments to the comprehensive plan. And that includes updates to the background information and findings in the plan. So that's really just summarizing what I just talked about, all that technical analysis. The goals and policies in the plan that really kind of guide how you help support future development of housing in terms of what the city can do towards that end, and what it can do to support the development community and real estate industry and others in helping actually produce the housing. And then implementation strategies, which then get a little bit more specific about particular actions or strategies the city can undertake to achieve the broader goals and policies that are identified in the plan. I will just give you kind of a quick summary of the types of revisions to goals and policies that we recommended or identified in this planning process, but the actual kind of underlying strike through language with the updates is in your packet, and I'm happy to answer questions about that later if you'd like me to. But the types of changes we recommended to goals and policies are summarized here. So one, just addressing what the housing needs analysis says in terms of the findings, incorporating kind of best practices around planning for development of housing. There was some information in the document in the comp plan, because this chapter is a number of years old, that was outdated. So we suggest eliminating the stuff that's not currently up to date, no longer accurate. There were a few duplicative policies, so we've kind of combined or streamlined some of those and recommended reducing some of that duplication, making sure that policies are courses of action, not just individual single actions, because it's a long-term document. You want those to be able to continue to be current over a number of years, not just something you'll finish doing a year from now and then that's out of date. Making sure that the policies don't equate to specific standards so that you don't have conflict between your comprehensive plan and your development code. And the converse is making sure that the policies are consistent with what's in your development code as well. referring to adopted supporting documents like the housing needs analysis. So just making sure the comp plan's referencing that, and then incorporating other community goals and objectives that relate directly to housing. So those are the types of changes that were recommended to the comprehensive plan goals, policies, and implementation actions. And I'm happy to take any questions y'all might have for me now or later. So I will stop, and maybe I'll stop sharing the screen as well, unless there's something anybody wants me to go back to in the presentation.
Okay, does anybody have any questions for Mr. Hasty or other members of the staff?
Sure. Actually, I want to relay a thought and comment from Wasco County Commissioner Scott Hagee, who has a little bit of a problem with PSU's population force.
Just a couple brief items. I wanted to let the council and community know in response to the Zoom bombing event that we had at the last city council meeting, that the city clerk and I have reported that incident to the Oregon Department of Justice, who is appreciative for the information, has been working with the FBI, as a number of different cities around the country and throughout the state have been having similar occurrences. And so we followed up on that item. We'll also be trialing a few different public participation policy changes with members who want to participate in audience participation via Zoom, need to essentially sign up with the city clerk by noon the day of the meeting. And so we'll see how those changes work out. And then the last, very briefly, is just it's from Quality Life or Q Life. That is the fiber company or fiber agency that was formed between the city of the Dalles and Wasco County. We had a couple months ago brought on a consultant to help review and update the strategic plan or future next steps for Q Life on its ongoing mission to provide and foster good service to our community, internet service. We had a draft interim report submitted to the board last Thursday, and there'll be some additional updates in the coming months as we finalize that report and kind of set the future and some of the next steps that Q Life would be considering.